New York City, 1922. The L train screams overhead on 2nd Avenue, throwing broken shadows across a butcher shop where a fat man in a cheap suit eats his lunch behind bulletproof glass he had installed himself. Outside, 4 men with revolvers step out of a black touring car. They walk in like they own the sidewalk. They open fire through the window, 6 shots, 7, 8, and every single one misses. The glass shatters. The bread rolls off the table. And the fat man doesn't even stand up. He finishes his coffee, brushes the crumbs off his vest, and walks out the front door past the men who came to kill him, without a scratch on his body. They called him, the man who can dodge bullets. He would survive that ambush, and another after that, so many attempts on his life that gunmen across the city began to whisper that God himself was protecting Giuseppe Masseria. But God, or luck, or fate, or whatever force had shielded him through a decade of gang war, was not going to protect him forever. Because the man Joe Masseria would eventually build, the empire he would carve out of blood and terror, would one day be torn down by the very soldiers he trained. And the war he started, the last old world war between old country dons, would not just kill him. It would kill the entire structure of the mafia as anyone had ever known it, and give birth to something colder, more corporate, more American. Something that still exists today. This is the story of the man who ruled New York's underworld from the shadows of a card table, who ate lunch through a hail of bullets and called it a Tuesday, who believed with every fiber of his enormous body that he was untouchable, right up until the moment 4 men walked into a restaurant in Coney Island, and the boy he had raised like a son excused himself to go to the bathroom, and never came back. Before we go into the shadows, I want to know who's walking in there with me tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now in your corner of the world. I read every single one, and there's something about knowing exactly who's out there in the dark with me before we start a story like this one. So take a second. Then let's begin. To understand how a man becomes a king of the underworld, you have to go back before the crowns, before the money, before the blood-soaked restaurants of Coney Island. You have to go back to a boy born into a world that had already decided he was worth nothing. Giuseppe Masseria was born in January of 1886, in the town of Menfi, a dusty agricultural settlement carved into the western hills of Sicily, in the province of Agrigento. It was not a place that produced kings. It was a place that produced laborers, men who worked the sulfur mines or the wheat fields or the lemon groves, who lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, who answered to landlords and to the church and, above all, to the quiet, watchful men who ran the local mafia, men who collected their tribute, settled their disputes, and reminded everyone, without ever needing to raise their voice, exactly who held the real power in a land where the official government barely existed. At all. Sicily in the late 19th century was not romantic. It was brutal. The island had been absorbed into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy only a couple of decades before Masseria's birth, and to the peasants of the Sicilian interior, that unification meant almost nothing except higher taxes and a more distant, more indifferent government. The real law, the law that actually reached into every village and every family, was the law of Cosa Nostra, our thing, an organization of men who had grown out of the chaos of feudal collapse, who protected the interests of the landowners against the peasants and, when it suited them, protected the peasants against everyone else, all for a price, always for a price. Little is known, reliably known, anyway, about Masseria's earliest childhood. Records from rural Sicily in this period are patchy, often lost to fires, wars, and simple administrative indifference. But we know enough about the world into which he was born to understand the forces that shaped him. Poverty was not an occasional visitor to families like his, it was a permanent resident. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Disease swept through towns like Menfi with terrifying regularity, cholera, typhoid, malaria carried on the wings of mosquitoes that bred in the marshy lowlands near the coast. A boy who survived to the age of 10 in that world had already beaten odds that would stagger a modern statistician. And Masseria did survive, not just childhood, but something else, something that would come to define the entire shape of his life and give birth to the legend that would follow him across an ocean. As a teenager, sometime in his adolescence, Giuseppe Masseria was shot. The precise circumstances are murky, buried under a century of retelling and mythologizing, but the story that survived, the story his own men would tell in hushed, half-superstitious tones decades later on the streets of New York, was that young Giuseppe took a bullet meant to kill him, and lived. He walked away. He did not die when the laws of nature said he should have died. Whether this early brush with death was the result of a family feud, a dispute over honor, a random act of village violence, or something tied to the criminal underworld his family may already have brushed against, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that this single event, a bullet that should have ended a Sicilian farm boy's life before it had properly begun, became the seed of something larger. It became the first chapter in the myth of Joe Masseria, the man who could not be killed. And myths, as anyone who has ever run an organization built on fear understands instinctively, are not just stories. Myths are armor. Myths are currency. A man who is believed to be unkillable does not need to actually be unkillable, he only needs enough men to believe it, because belief is what keeps triggers from being pulled, what keeps knives from finding their mark, what turns hesitation into the half-second of doubt that saves a life. Masseria emigrated to the United States sometime in the first years of the 20th century. Most accounts place his arrival in New York around 1903, when he would have been a teenager, one face among the extraordinary human tide of Sicilian and southern Italian immigrants pouring through Ellis Island in those years. Between 1900 and 1910 alone, more than 2 million Italians arrived in the United States, the overwhelming majority from the impoverished South, Sicily, Calabria, Campania, fleeing a homeland that offered them nothing but hard labor, hunger, and the crushing weight of a social order that had no room for them to rise. They did not arrive to open arms. New York in the early 1900s treated its Italian immigrants with a contempt that is almost difficult to comprehend from a modern vantage point. Newspapers routinely described Italians, especially Sicilians, as racially inferior, prone to violence, unassimilable, dangerous. The term "Black Hand" had already entered the American vocabulary, describing extortion rings that preyed specifically on Italian immigrant communities, and the broader American public made little distinction between the criminals who used that name and the millions of hard-working, law-abiding Italians who had simply come looking for a better life. Landlords packed Italian families into overcrowded tenements on the Lower East Side and in East Harlem. Factory owners paid Italian laborers less than their native-born or even other immigrant counterparts. Police treated Italian neighborhoods as occupied territory, hostile and suspect by default. Into this world, cramped, hostile, teeming with desperate men looking for any edge that might lift them out of poverty, young Giuseppe Masseria arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back, a bit of Sicilian dialect, and whatever hard lessons he had already absorbed about how power actually worked in a world where the official rules did not protect people like him. The Lower East Side in the early 20th century was not one neighborhood but a patchwork of overlapping, often hostile ethnic enclaves. Jewish immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe crowded into blocks along Delancey and Rivington streets, Italians clustered around Mulberry Street and the area that would become known as Little Italy, Chinese immigrants a few blocks over. Each community developed its own internal economy, often running parallel to and sometimes in open defiance of the official laws of the city, networks of mutual aid, informal lending, and, inevitably, organized criminal activity that filled the vacuum left by a police force that showed little interest in protecting these communities and even less interest in understanding them. For a young man like Masseria, with limited formal education, limited English, and an accent that marked him instantly as an outsider even within New York's own diverse underworld, the choices were narrow. He could work himself into an early grave in a garment sweatshop or on a construction crew for wages that barely covered rent in a tenement shared by a dozen people. Or he could look for opportunity in the shadow economy that was already thriving in the streets around him, gambling, loan sharking, protection rackets, the small-scale extortion schemes that preyed on merchants too frightened or too disconnected from the legal system to seek any other recourse. Masseria chose the shadows. And he did not choose them tentatively. By his early 20s, Masseria had built a reputation on the Lower East Side, not yet as a boss, not yet as a man with soldiers and territory, but as someone dangerous, someone unpredictable, someone willing to use violence without the hesitation that restrained other men. He was arrested multiple times in these early years, for burglary in 1913, and again on other charges as the decade wore on, but the arrests never seemed to stick in any way that mattered. Witnesses recanted. Cases fell apart. Whether through intimidation, bribery, or simple institutional incompetence, Masseria walked away from the legal system again and again, reinforcing, this time not through a bullet wound but through the more mundane machinery of American law enforcement, the sense that this was a man against whom the ordinary rules simply did not apply. What set Masseria apart from countless other small-time hoodlums grinding out a living in New York's immigrant underworld was not intelligence in the conventional sense. He was not a man given to elaborate schemes or careful long-term planning, and history would eventually judge him as tactically limited, even reckless. What set him apart was something more primal, an absolute, bone-deep hunger for power, combined with a willingness to use violence not as a last resort but as a first instrument of policy. Where other men negotiated, Masseria intimidated. Where other men sought accommodation, Masseria sought domination. He was, from the very beginning, a man building not a business but a kingdom, and kingdoms, in his understanding of the world, were built by conquest. By the late 1910s and into the early 1920s, the ground was shifting beneath New York's Italian underworld in ways that would prove enormously consequential for a man with Masseria's particular appetites. The old-world criminal structures that Italian immigrants had brought with them, small, localized bands loosely organized around neighborhood loyalty, family ties, and the informal authority of respected older men, were being disrupted by two enormous forces. The first was simple demographic growth. New York's Italian population had exploded in the preceding 2 decades, and with it, the criminal economy that fed off vice and desperation within those communities had grown correspondingly larger and more lucrative. The second, and far more transformative, force arrived in January of 1920, when the United States government, in an act of moral overreach that would reshape organized crime forever, ratified the 18th Amendment and made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the entire country. Prohibition did not create organized crime in America. But it did something perhaps even more significant: it professionalized it, industrialized it, and handed to men like Joe Masseria an opportunity that no honest laborer, no matter how hard-working, could ever hope to match. Overnight, an enormous, wealthy, thirsty American public was cut off from a product it had no intention of giving up. And someone was going to supply that product. The only question was who. Masseria, watching from his position of growing influence on the Lower East Side, understood immediately what prohibition meant. It meant that the small-time protection rackets and gambling dens that had defined the previous generation of Italian organized crime were about to become a sideshow. The real money, staggering, transformative amounts of money, was going to flow through the illegal liquor trade, the smuggling of whiskey down from Canada, the importation of rum from the Caribbean, the operation of hidden breweries and distilleries scattered through basements and warehouses across the 5 boroughs, and above all, the distribution networks required to move all of that product from ships and stills into the speakeasies, restaurants, and private clubs where a newly criminalized America was determined to keep drinking exactly as it always had. But there was a problem, and it was a problem that would come to define the entire arc of Masseria's rise, and eventually his fall. New York's Italian underworld in the early 1920s was not a single organization. It was a fractured landscape of competing gangs, competing bosses, and competing loyalties, some rooted in specific Sicilian villages of origin, some in older feuds carried across the Atlantic, some simply in the raw territorial logic of who controlled which blocks, which docks, which speakeasies. There was no single king. There was no unified command. And into that vacuum of fractured authority, a handful of ambitious, ruthless men began positioning themselves for a war that everyone could feel coming but that no one, perhaps not even Masseria himself in these early years, fully understood the scale of. Masseria's own rise through this landscape was neither gentle nor gradual. He built his power the way he had built his reputation on the street corners of the Lower East Side, through direct, often shockingly public acts of violence, through the elimination of rivals rather than negotiation with them, and through an almost animal instinct for sensing weakness in other men and exploiting it before they could recover. By the early 1920s, he had become one of the most powerful bosses in the city's Italian underworld, commanding a network of soldiers and lieutenants that stretched across bootlegging operations, gambling dens, and the extortion rackets that had always formed the bedrock of his income. And it was around this time, as his power grew, as his enemies multiplied, as the stakes of every deal and every territorial dispute climbed higher and higher, that the attempts on his life began in earnest. The ambush outside the restaurant on 2nd Avenue in the summer of 1922, where 4 gunmen emptied their revolvers through a plate glass window and somehow, impossibly, missed a man who did not even bother to duck, was not an isolated incident. It was one of several attempts made on Masseria's life during this period of violent consolidation, as rival factions within New York's fractured underworld recognized, correctly, that Masseria's ambitions threatened to swallow their own territory, their own soldiers, their own slice of the enormous new wealth that Prohibition had made available. Each time Masseria survived, the legend grew. Men who had grown up in the superstitious, old-world Catholicism of southern Italy, men for whom the line between the rational and the supernatural had never been drawn as sharply as it was for their American-born children, began to speak of Masseria in terms that bordered on the mystical. He could not be hit. Bullets bent around him. God, or the devil, or some darker and more ancient Sicilian force, had marked him as untouchable. Masseria himself did nothing to discourage this reputation. If anything, he cultivated it, understood instinctively, as any man who has ever built power through fear must understand, that the myth of invincibility was itself a weapon, arguably a more valuable one than any gun. A man who is feared as unkillable does not need to fight every battle personally. His rivals will hesitate. His soldiers will follow him with a devotion bordering on the religious. And in the brutal calculus of underworld politics, hesitation and devotion were worth more than any amount of raw firepower. But there is a particular danger, a particular trap, buried inside every myth of invincibility, and it is this: the man at the center of the myth begins, eventually, to believe it himself. He stops taking the ordinary precautions that keep ordinary men alive. He grows careless in small ways, where he eats, who he trusts, which doors he walks through without a second thought. The myth that protects him in the eyes of his enemies begins, slowly and invisibly, to erode the instincts that had kept him alive in the years before the myth existed at all. That erosion would not become fatal for Joe Masseria for many years yet. In the early 1920s, he was still ascending, still consolidating, still absorbing rival gangs and eliminating rival bosses with a ruthlessness that would eventually earn him a title that struck fear into the hearts of an entire generation of New York gangsters, Joe the Boss. He did not yet control all of New York's Italian underworld, that remained a fractured, violent landscape of competing interests, but he controlled more of it than any single man had before him, and he was hungry, relentlessly hungry, for the rest. Somewhere in these years, working his way up through the ranks of Masseria's growing organization, a young man began to attract Joe the Boss's attention, a sharp, ambitious, unusually well-dressed young gangster who had a gift for numbers, for organization, for seeing the underworld not as a collection of neighborhood turf wars but as something that could be run, if a man were smart enough and patient enough, like an actual business. His name was Charles Luciano. And the relationship that would develop between the aging, superstitious, old-world boss and his brilliant, forward-thinking young lieutenant would become one of the most consequential partnerships, and eventually, one of the most consequential betrayals, in the entire history of American organized crime. But that story, the story of how Joe Masseria built the closest thing New York had ever seen to a single unified criminal empire, and how the very men he trusted most began, quietly, patiently, to plan his destruction, that story is only beginning. Because the myth of the man who could not be killed was about to be tested by something far more dangerous than a rival's bullet. It was about to be tested by ambition wearing a friendly face, by loyalty that was never quite what it appeared to be, and by a war, the Castellammarese War, that would tear the old Sicilian underworld apart and rebuild it into something Masseria himself would never live to see. By the middle of the 1920s, Giuseppe Masseria was no longer simply a dangerous man on the Lower East Side. He was becoming something closer to an institution, a name spoken in careful, respectful whispers in the back rooms of social clubs on Mulberry Street, in the offices of corrupt ward politicians, in the smoke-filled gambling parlors where fortunes changed hands over games that Masseria's men either ran directly or taxed heavily for the privilege of operating. He was Joe the Boss now, a title that had not been given to him so much as it had simply calcified around him, the way a nickname does when enough frightened men use it enough times that it stops being a description and becomes a fact. But titles, however fearsome, are not the same thing as thrones, and Masseria understood this better than almost anyone in his organization. New York's Italian underworld in 1925 remained a patchwork, a fractured territory of competing factions, each rooted in its own regional loyalties, its own family alliances, its own decades-old grudges carried across an ocean from villages in Sicily and Naples that most of these men's American-born children would never even see. There were Neapolitan gangs and Calabrian gangs. There were factions built around specific towns in western Sicily. There were older, established criminal societies whose leadership stretched back to the earliest waves of Italian immigration, and there were newer, hungrier crews of young second-generation gangsters who had grown up on the streets of East Harlem and Brooklyn and who looked at the old-world deference their fathers had shown to men like Masseria with a certain skepticism, even contempt. Masseria's genius, and it is important to use that word carefully, because history would eventually be unkind to Masseria's reputation for strategic thinking, was not subtlety. It was appetite, applied with a kind of relentless, grinding persistence that wore down rival after rival through sheer attrition. Where a more patient man might have sought alliances, might have built coalitions, might have absorbed rival factions through negotiation and shared profit, Masseria's preferred instrument remained the one that had served him since his earliest days on the Lower East Side: violence, applied directly, applied publicly, applied until the men standing in his way were no longer standing at all. Throughout the mid-1920s, Masseria fought and largely won a series of increasingly bloody territorial conflicts that steadily expanded his reach across Manhattan and into the outer boroughs. He absorbed weaker gangs. He eliminated rival bosses who refused to fall in line, sometimes through direct assassination, sometimes through the slower, more patient work of undermining their soldiers' loyalty until the rival boss found himself standing alone, his own men having quietly defected to the side that seemed likelier to keep paying and likelier to keep them alive. By the second half of the decade, Masseria commanded what was, by any reasonable measure, the single largest and most powerful Italian criminal organization in New York City, an empire built on bootlegging profits that dwarfed anything the city's underworld had produced in the pre-Prohibition years, supplemented by the older, steadier income streams of gambling, loan sharking, and extortion that had always formed the bedrock of his power. It was during this period of expansion that Masseria's relationship with a young gangster named Charles Luciano deepened from a working association into something that would prove far more consequential, and far more dangerous, than either man could have anticipated at the time. Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in the Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti in 1897, had arrived in New York as a child, part of the same great wave of immigration that had carried Masseria across the Atlantic a few years earlier. But Luciano's formative years had been shaped by American streets in a way that Masseria's never had. He had grown up not in the old-world social structures of a Sicilian village transplanted wholesale into an American tenement, but in the genuinely mixed, genuinely chaotic streets of the Lower East Side, where Italian, Jewish, and Irish immigrant children fought and hustled and occasionally cooperated with one another in ways that would have been unthinkable in the old country. It was on those streets that Luciano formed some of the relationships that would prove most consequential to his later career, most notably his friendship with a young Jewish gangster named Meyer Lansky, a partnership that would eventually help reshape the entire structure of American organized crime. Luciano was, in almost every respect, a different kind of criminal than Masseria. Where Masseria was old-world, superstitious, prone to violent impulse and stubborn attachment to the traditional hierarchies of Sicilian criminal culture, Luciano was forward-looking, calculating, and increasingly convinced that the ethnic and regional divisions that defined the older generation of gangsters were, from a purely business perspective, an enormous and unnecessary liability. Why should Italian gangsters refuse to do business with Jewish gangsters like Lansky, or Irish gangsters, when cooperation across those lines could mean access to broader distribution networks, more sophisticated financial arrangements, more effective corruption of police and politicians? Why should criminal organizations remain structured around the honor codes and family loyalties of specific Sicilian villages, when a more corporate, more rationalized structure, territories divided by agreement rather than by war, profits shared according to negotiated arrangement rather than seized through violence, might produce more money, more stability, and far fewer bullets for everyone involved? These were not yet fully formed ideas in the mid-1920s. They would not crystallize into anything resembling a coherent philosophy of organized crime until later, and even then, largely in hindsight, through the accounts of men who survived long enough to tell their stories to journalists and investigators. But the seeds of that thinking were already present in the young Luciano, who rose steadily through Masseria's organization during these years, impressing the older boss with a combination of ruthlessness. Luciano was, whatever his forward-thinking business instincts, entirely capable of ordering or personally carrying out violence when the situation demanded it, and a kind of cool, business-like competence that Masseria, for all his own brutal effectiveness, simply did not possess. Masseria came to rely on Luciano heavily, promoting him to a position of significant trust and authority within the organization, treating him, according to accounts that would emerge later from men who observed their relationship, almost as a favored son, a comparison that carries a particular weight and a particular irony given how their story would eventually end. Luciano, for his part, played the role expected of him with what appears, in retrospect, to have been considerable patience and considerable calculation. He deferred to Masseria publicly. He carried out the older boss's orders. He built his own network of loyal soldiers and lieutenants, men like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, capable, ambitious criminals in their own right, while never appearing to challenge Masseria's ultimate authority. But beneath that surface of loyalty, tensions were accumulating that would eventually prove impossible to contain. Luciano and the younger, more Americanized gangsters who increasingly populated the upper ranks of organizations like Masseria's had begun to chafe against what they viewed as the outdated, inefficient, and frankly dangerous habits of the old-world Sicilian bosses, men the younger generation had begun, with a mixture of respect and derision, to call mustache Petes, a reference to the old-fashioned facial hair and old-fashioned thinking they associated with an earlier generation of criminal leadership. The mustache Petes, in the eyes of men like Luciano, were too rigid, too bound by honor codes and regional loyalties that had made sense in the villages of Sicily but made considerably less sense on the streets of a city where cooperation across ethnic lines could mean the difference between enormous profit and constant, grinding warfare. They were too quick to resort to violence when negotiation might serve just as well, and too slow to understand that the modern criminal economy prohibition had rewarded organization, discretion, and long-term thinking far more than it rewarded raw territorial dominance enforced at gunpoint. Masseria, whatever his other qualities, was in many respects the very embodiment of the mustache Pete archetype that the younger generation had grown increasingly impatient with, even as they served him, even as they profited enormously under his protection, even as his growing empire provided the platform from which their own ambitions could eventually be launched. By the late 1920s, Masseria's power had grown to the point where he controlled, by most estimates, the single largest criminal organization in New York, encompassing dozens of crews and soldiers spread across bootlegging, gambling, and extortion operations that generated enormous sums of money on a weekly basis. He had become, in the eyes of much of the city's underworld, something close to a boss of bosses, not through any formal title, since no such formal structure yet existed among New York's Italian gangs, but through the simple, brutal fact of controlling more territory, more men, and more money than any rival. But an empire built entirely on the personal dominance of one man, sustained through fear and violence rather than through any more durable institutional structure, carries within it the seeds of its own instability, and there remained, even at the height of Masseria's power in the late 1920s, one significant rival faction that refused to bend the knee. That faction was based not in Manhattan but out in Brooklyn, centered around a group of relatively recent Sicilian immigrants who had come to New York from the town of Castellammarese del Golfo, a coastal community in western Sicily with its own deep, distinct traditions of clan loyalty and criminal organization stretching back generations. These Castellammarese, as they came to be known, had built their own criminal network in Brooklyn under the leadership of a series of bosses, and by the late 1920s, that leadership had increasingly consolidated around a sharp, disciplined, and deeply traditional figure named Salvatore Maranzano, a man who, in his own way, represented an even more rigid and old-world approach to organized crime than Masseria himself, a man steeped in classical education and Sicilian tradition who reportedly saw himself, without any apparent trace of irony, as something like a modern-day Julius Caesar, destined to unify New York's fractured underworld under his own singular authority. Masseria, whose entire career had been built on the systematic absorption or elimination of rival factions, could not tolerate the continued independence of the Castellammarese. From his perspective, the calculation was straightforward, even simple. Maranzano's faction controlled valuable territory and a well-organized, loyal network of soldiers, and any criminal organization that remained outside Masseria's control represented both a practical threat to his revenue and an intolerable insult to the supremacy he had spent nearly 2 decades building through blood and terror. Masseria began, through a combination of demands for tribute, attempts at absorption, and outright threats, to pressure the Castellammarese faction to submit to his authority, to acknowledge him, in effect, as the singular boss of New York's entire Italian underworld. Maranzano refused. And Maranzano was not a man built for submission any more than Masseria was. What followed, beginning in earnest around 1930, would come to be known as the Castellammarese War, a brutal, sprawling conflict between Masseria's forces and Maranzano's Castellammarese faction that would eventually draw in nearly every significant Italian criminal organization in New York, would claim dozens of lives over the course of roughly a year and a half of intermittent, vicious warfare, and would ultimately produce a result that neither of the two aging, old-world bosses at the center of the conflict could have anticipated or, in Masseria's case, survived to witness in its final form. The war did not erupt instantly or cleanly. It built gradually, through a series of escalating provocations, ambushes, and reprisals, as both sides tested each other's strength and resolve while simultaneously working to secure alliances among the smaller, uncommitted factions scattered across the city. Masseria, drawing on the sheer size of the organization he had spent years building, initially appeared to hold the advantage. He commanded more soldiers, more territory, and a deeper well of financial resources drawn from his extensive bootlegging and gambling operations. Maranzano, for his part, drew on the fierce loyalty of the Castellammarese clan network, a loyalty rooted in shared regional origin and reinforced by Maranzano's own reputation for discipline and organizational sophistication. For Charles Luciano and the other ambitious young lieutenants serving under Masseria, the Castellammarese War presented both danger and opportunity in roughly equal measure. Danger, because a prolonged, bloody conflict between two powerful factions threatened to consume enormous resources and enormous numbers of soldiers on both sides, destabilizing the very criminal economy from which men like Luciano had been steadily building their own fortunes. But opportunity as well, because a war of this scale, a war that pitted two rigid, old-world bosses against each other in a fight neither seemed inclined to resolve through negotiation, created exactly the kind of chaos in which a patient, calculating younger generation of gangsters might eventually find room to maneuver, to negotiate independently, and perhaps, if circumstances aligned correctly, to emerge from the wreckage of the old order with power that neither Masseria nor Maranzano would have willingly granted them. What Masseria did not yet understand, could not yet understand, wrapped as he was in the old-world assumptions of loyalty and hierarchy that had governed his entire criminal career, was that the war he had started in pursuit of absolute, singular dominance over New York's underworld was, in fact, setting the stage for his own downfall. Because as the fighting dragged on through 1930 and into 1931, as the death toll mounted and the strain on both organizations grew increasingly unsustainable, the very men Masseria trusted most, the young, Americanized lieutenants he had promoted, mentored, and treated with a degree of paternal favor, had begun to look past him entirely, toward a resolution to the war that neither Masseria's continued rule nor an outright Castellammarese victory could fully satisfy. Luciano, in particular, had begun conducting quiet, unauthorized conversations, first tentative, then increasingly serious, about the possibility of ending the war not through the total military victory of one side over the other, but through the elimination of the two old-world bosses whose personal rivalry had made peaceful negotiation impossible in the first place. It was an idea of breathtaking audacity and equally breathtaking treachery, to end the Castellammarese War not by winning it for Masseria, but by removing Masseria from the equation entirely, clearing the path for a new kind of criminal order, one built not around the personal, almost feudal authority of a single dominant boss, but around a more distributed, more business-like structure in which power would be shared among a commission of leaders, each governing his own territory, each bound not by fear of a singular Joe the boss but by mutual self-interest and negotiated agreement. Whether Luciano had fully formed this vision by the early months of 1931, or whether it crystallized more gradually through his conversations with Maranzano's own representatives and with allies like Lansky, remains a matter of historical debate. What is not in doubt is that by the spring of 1931, Charles Luciano, the young Lieutenant Masseria had promoted, trusted, and treated almost as a son, had made a decision that would end the Castellammarese War, reshape the entire structure of American organized crime, and bring the long, improbable, bullet-dodging life of Giuseppe Masseria to its final, brutal conclusion. It would happen, fittingly for a man whose entire criminal life had been built around appetite, at a restaurant table, over a plate of food, in the company of a friend Masseria trusted completely, on an ordinary afternoon that Masseria had no reason to suspect would be his last. Before we step back into the war, if this story has its hooks in you the way it should, take a second and hit that subscribe button. There are more tales like this one waiting in the shadows, men who built empires out of nothing and lost them in the space of a single gunshot, and I don't want you to miss the next one. Alright. Let's go back to 1930, back to a city about to tear itself apart. By the autumn of 1930, the conflict that would come to be called the Castellammarese War had stopped being a series of isolated incidents and had become something closer to an actual, sustained campaign of urban guerrilla warfare, fought not on open battlefields but in the alleys, barbershops, restaurants, and tenement stairwells of a city that had, for the better part of a decade, allowed its Italian underworld to grow rich and powerful on the profits of Prohibition without ever quite reckoning with what would happen when that underworld turned its guns inward on itself. The mechanics of the war were, in their own grim way, almost mundane. This was not fought with the kind of dramatic, cinematic set-piece battles that later films and television would impose on this era for the sake of narrative clarity. It was fought through ambush and assassination, through men gunned down on street corners while lighting cigarettes, through bodies found in the trunks of automobiles parked on quiet residential blocks in Brooklyn and the Bronx, through soldiers who simply vanished one day and were never seen again, their absence a kind of message understood perfectly by everyone in the underworld even though no formal announcement was ever made. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of war that men like Masseria had waged their entire lives, brutal, personal, transactional violence, scaled up now to a citywide conflict involving hundreds of soldiers on both sides. Masseria commanded the larger force, and in the opening months of the war, that numerical advantage told. His soldiers moved aggressively against Castellammarese-aligned crews, particularly in Brooklyn, where Maranzano's faction drew most of its strength from tightly knit clusters of men connected by blood, marriage, and shared origin in the old country. Masseria's approach to the war, consistent with everything we know about his temperament, was direct and unsubtle: apply overwhelming force, eliminate key lieutenants, terrorize the base of support until the opposing faction's soldiers began to see the wisdom of switching sides or simply disappearing from the conflict altogether. For a time, this approach appeared to be working. Masseria's forces scored a series of early victories, killing several of Maranzano's key associates and putting considerable pressure on the Castellammarese network's ability to operate. Maranzano, watching his faction absorb these losses, retreated into a posture that was, in its own way, just as calculating as anything Luciano would later attempt. He consolidated his remaining forces, tightened security around his most essential lieutenants, and began quietly cultivating relationships with Italian-American gang leaders in other cities, understanding that the Castellammarese clan structure, with its roots extending well beyond New York into Sicilian immigrant communities across the country, gave him a strategic resource that Masseria's more geographically concentrated organization could not easily match. This is one of the aspects of the Castellammarese War that later accounts sometimes obscure in the interest of a cleaner narrative: it was never purely a New York conflict. Sicilian immigrant criminal networks in cities like Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, and Cleveland had their own internal loyalties and rivalries that mapped, often imperfectly but not insignificantly, onto the broader fault lines of the New York War. Maranzano, drawing on his connections to Castellammarese clan networks that stretched across these cities, was able to call on resources and manpower that helped offset Masseria's numerical superiority within the 5 boroughs themselves. Meanwhile, Masseria maintained his own alliances with powerful bosses in other cities, most notably in Chicago, where Al Capone's organization maintained a working relationship with Masseria's faction, providing another layer of complexity to a conflict that was never as simple as 2 rival gangs slugging it out over a few square miles of Brooklyn turf. The human cost of the war mounted steadily through the winter of 1930 and into the spring of 1931. Precise casualty figures from this period are notoriously difficult to establish with confidence. Newspaper reports of the era were often incomplete or sensationalized. Police records from Prohibition-era New York were spotty at best when it came to organized crime killings, and the underworld itself had every incentive to keep its own internal bookkeeping as quiet and untraceable as possible. But historians who have studied the period generally agree that the Castellammarese War claimed dozens of lives over its roughly 18-month duration, a toll that, while smaller in absolute numbers than the more famous gang conflicts of Prohibition-era Chicago, represented a genuinely destabilizing level of violence within New York's Italian criminal underworld. Violence that increasingly spilled beyond the boundaries of the underworld itself and into the awareness, and occasionally the direct path, of ordinary New Yorkers going about their daily lives. It was against this backdrop of mounting bloodshed and mounting exhaustion that the fractures within Masseria's own organization began to widen in ways that would eventually prove far more consequential than anything Maranzano's forces could accomplish through direct military action. Charles Luciano, as we discussed in the previous chapter of this story, had spent years cultivating a network of loyal soldiers and ambitious younger lieutenants who shared his growing conviction that the old-world rivalries driving men like Masseria and Maranzano toward mutual destruction were, from any rational business perspective, an enormous and unnecessary waste. As the war ground on through the winter of 1930 into 1931, and as the toll in dead soldiers, disrupted operations, and lost revenue continued to climb, that conviction hardened among Luciano's circle into something closer to a firm resolution. The specific details of how Luciano first opened lines of communication with Maranzano's camp remain, inevitably, somewhat obscured by the passage of time and the natural reluctance of men involved in a conspiracy of this magnitude to leave behind clear documentary evidence of their treachery. But the broad outline of what occurred has been reconstructed with reasonable confidence by historians and journalists who spent decades piecing together accounts from surviving participants, informants, and law enforcement investigations that continued for years after the war itself had ended. Sometime in the early months of 1931, Luciano, reportedly working through intermediaries, and taking considerable pains to ensure that word of these contacts did not reach Masseria, began negotiating what amounted to a separate peace with Maranzano's faction. The terms of this arrangement, as later accounts describe them, were as brutally simple as everything else in this story. Luciano would arrange for the elimination of Joe Masseria, ending Masseria's leadership of his own organization and, with it, the primary obstacle to ending the war. In exchange, Luciano and his allies within Masseria's organization would be permitted to retain their own positions, their own territories, and their own soldiers under a new arrangement to be worked out with Maranzano once the war had formally concluded. It is worth pausing here to consider the almost unbearable psychological weight of what Luciano was contemplating, because the sources are fairly consistent in describing the relationship between Masseria and Luciano as something considerably warmer, at least on Masseria's side, than a purely transactional business arrangement between a boss and his lieutenant. Masseria had promoted Luciano rapidly, had entrusted him with responsibilities well beyond what a purely mercenary calculation might have justified, and had, according to multiple accounts from men who observed the two of them together, displayed toward Luciano something approaching genuine paternal affection, an old man's pride, perhaps, in a sharp, capable young protégé who reminded him, in some flattering way, of the ambition and ruthlessness that had once driven his own rise from a penniless immigrant on the Lower East Side to the most powerful boss in New York's underworld. Whether Luciano felt any genuine conflict about the betrayal he was now orchestrating is impossible to know with certainty. The man himself, in later years, when he spoke to journalists and biographers about this period of his life, tended to describe his decision in purely pragmatic terms, framing it as a necessary and even inevitable business decision rather than a personal betrayal. The war, in Luciano's later telling, simply could not continue. It was destroying profits, destroying manpower, and threatening to draw the kind of sustained, high-profile police and press attention that no criminal enterprise, however well connected, could survive indefinitely. Masseria, in Luciano's account, had become an obstacle not because of any personal animosity but because his stubborn, old-world insistence on total victory made any negotiated peace with Maranzano's faction impossible as long as he remained in charge. Whatever the precise mixture of cold calculation and personal ambition that drove Luciano's decision, the plan itself, once set into motion in the spring of 1931, proceeded with the same brutal efficiency that had characterized Masseria's own rise to power years earlier, a grim symmetry that would not have been lost on anyone who understood the underworld's particular logic, where the methods that build an empire are so often the same methods, turned inward, that eventually tear it down. Masseria, for his part, remained apparently unaware of the depth of the conspiracy forming around him, even as the pressures of the ongoing war and the mounting casualties on both sides had begun, by the spring of 1931, to genuinely wear on him. Some accounts from this period describe a Masseria who had grown increasingly erratic, increasingly paranoid in some respects yet stubbornly, catastrophically trusting in others, a man capable of ordering brutal violence against distant rivals while remaining almost willfully blind to the possibility that the threat closest to him might come from within his own inner circle, from the very lieutenant he had raised up and trusted above almost anyone else in his organization. This is, in many ways, the tragic pattern that runs through the entire history of organized crime, repeating itself with almost mechanical regularity across different eras, different cities, and different criminal organizations, the boss who builds his power through the elimination of external enemies, who becomes so attuned to threats from rival factions that he loses the capacity to recognize the threat quietly assembling within his own ranks. Masseria had survived so many attempts on his life from external rivals, the ambush on 2nd Avenue in 1922, and others in the years that followed, that he had, perhaps understandably, come to think of his own vulnerability primarily in terms of enemies outside his organization. The idea that the true danger might come from a trusted lieutenant, a man he had personally elevated and protected, appears not to have registered with him as a serious possibility, even as the war dragged into its final, exhausted months and the pressure to find some resolution grew increasingly intense on all sides. By April of 1931, the machinery of Luciano's plan had been set fully into motion. Maranzano's forces, aware of the arrangement being negotiated on the other side of the conflict, held their military pressure largely in check, waiting for the resolution that Luciano had promised to deliver. Within Masseria's own organization, the small circle of lieutenants who had been drawn into Luciano's confidence, men including Vito Genovese, who would go on to become one of the most notorious and feared figures in the later history of the American Mafia, began quietly preparing for the moment when the war's final act would play out. Masseria himself, in these final weeks, appears to have sensed at least some of the accumulated exhaustion of the long conflict, even if he remained blind to its true source. Associates who observed him during this period described a boss increasingly eager for some kind of resolution to a war that had, by this point, dragged on for the better part of a year and a half, consuming resources and lives at a pace that even a criminal organization as large and well-financed as Masseria's could not sustain indefinitely. It is one of the darker ironies of this story that Masseria, in his own way, wanted the war to end almost as badly as the men who were about to end it for him. He simply had no idea that the ending being prepared was not the negotiated victory he imagined, but his own death. On the 20th of April, 1931, Masseria was invited by Luciano to join him for lunch and an afternoon of cards at a restaurant in Coney Island, a place called Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a modest establishment that Masseria had visited before, a place where he felt, by every account that survives, entirely comfortable, entirely among friends. There was nothing in the invitation itself, nothing in the familiar, easy rhythm of the day that followed, to suggest to Masseria that anything was amiss. He had spent countless afternoons exactly this way, good food, cards, the easy company of men he trusted, the particular pleasure of a boss who has, for a few hours at least, set aside the constant calculations of war and simply allowed himself to enjoy the fruits of everything he had built. He could not have known, as he sat down at that table in Coney Island on an ordinary spring afternoon, that he was, in the most literal sense imaginable, eating his last meal. He could not have known that the boy he had raised up, the sharp young protégé he had trusted with more responsibility than almost any other man in his organization, had already made the arrangements that would end, within a matter of hours, the improbable, bullet-dodging life of the man they called Joe the Boss. What happened next, the excuse Luciano offered to step away from the table, the men who walked through the door of Nuova Villa tomorrow in his absence, and the final, brutal moments of Giuseppe Masseria's life, is where we'll pick up next time, in the fourth part of this story. Because what happened in that Coney Island restaurant did not just end one man's life. It ended an era. And it set in motion a transformation of the American underworld whose consequences are still, in ways most people never think about, shaping organized crime to this very day. April 20th, 1931. Spring had come to New York, the kind of pale, uncertain spring that Coney Island wears best, the boardwalk half empty, the amusement rides still shaking off their winter rust, the ocean wind carrying salt and the smell of fried food down streets that would not fill with real crowds for another month or two. It was, in other words, a quiet day. An unremarkable day. Exactly the kind of day a man plans a murder around, because quiet days do not draw witnesses, and unremarkable days do not stay in anyone's memory long enough to become a problem. Nuova Villa tomorrow sat on West 15th Street, modest Italian restaurant that catered to exactly the kind of clientele you would expect in that corner of Brooklyn, local families, a scattering of tourists drawn down by the promise of the boardwalk, and, on certain afternoons, men who did business that had nothing to do with the menu. Masseria had eaten there before. He knew the owner. He liked the food. There was nothing about the restaurant itself that should have troubled a man who had, by 1931, survived more assassination attempts than most gangsters of his era combined. Luciano arrived with him, or met him there. The accounts differ slightly on this detail, the way accounts of underworld events from this era almost always differ slightly, filtered as they are through decades of retelling, informant testimony gathered long after the fact, and the natural human tendency to smooth a true story into a better one. What the accounts agree on is the shape of the afternoon: lunch, easy conversation, and then cards. A long, lazy game that stretched from early afternoon into the hours after the lunch crowd had thinned and the restaurant had settled into that particular mid-afternoon quiet that empties out a dining room and leaves only a handful of tables occupied. Masseria, by every surviving account, was in good spirits. He had reason to be. The war that had consumed the better part of 2 years of his life, that had cost him soldiers and money and no small amount of sleep, appeared, from where he sat, to be approaching some kind of resolution. He did not know the shape that resolution was about to take. He believed, as far as anyone can reconstruct his state of mind in those final hours, that he was simply enjoying a card game with a trusted lieutenant on a slow Brooklyn afternoon, the kind of ordinary, comfortable moment that a man who has spent his entire adult life surrounded by violence learns to treasure precisely because it is so rare. At some point in the afternoon, accounts place it somewhere after 3 o'clock, Luciano excused himself from the table. The reason given, according to the version of events that has been repeated most consistently across decades of retelling by journalists, historians, and law enforcement officials who investigated the killing afterward, was simple and mundane: he needed to use the restroom. It is one of the strange, almost absurd details that history sometimes hands down to us from its most consequential moments, that the man who had engineered the death of the most powerful boss in New York's underworld chose, as his alibi, an excuse so ordinary that no one at the table thought twice about it. Masseria remained at the table, alone now except for the cards spread in front of him, waiting for his companion to return. He did not have to wait long. Almost as soon as Luciano had disappeared toward the back of the restaurant, 4 men walked in through the front door. Their identities have never been established with complete, courtroom-grade certainty. This is, again, one of the enduring features of underworld history from this period, where so much of what we know comes not from physical evidence or eyewitness testimony given under oath, but from the informal, half-whispered accounts that circulated within the criminal world itself and were later passed along to journalists, biographers, and law enforcement informants over the following decades. But the names most consistently associated with the killing, repeated across the accounts that have accumulated the most credibility among historians of this era, are Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel, for men who would go on, in the years and decades that followed, to become among the most feared and formidable figures in the entire history of American organized crime. What happened next took, by most accounts, only a matter of seconds. The four men crossed the restaurant floor and opened fire on Masseria as he sat at the table, cards still in front of him. He was hit multiple times. Accounts vary on the exact number of wounds, ranging from 4 to 6 gunshots, but the effect was the same regardless of the precise count. The man who had dodged bullets through a plate glass window on 2nd Avenue 9 years earlier, the man whose survival through repeated assassination attempts had built a legend of near supernatural invincibility among the soldiers and rivals who both feared and half believed in him, died at that table in Coney Island in the span of a few violent seconds. The myth of the man who could not be killed ending exactly the way every such myth eventually ends, with an ordinary bullet, fired by ordinary men, on an ordinary afternoon. The gunmen left as quickly as they had arrived. By the time Luciano emerged from the restroom, and there is a particular, almost theatrical cruelty to this detail that has made it one of the most enduring images associated with the entire Castellammarese War, Masseria's body lay slumped at the card table, and the restaurant, according to the accounts that have survived, was already largely empty, the handful of other patrons and staff having fled or made themselves scarce in the chaos of the shooting. Luciano, by his own later account, an account he gave, decades afterward, to journalists and biographers with the same cool, matter-of-fact detachment he had reportedly displayed throughout the entire episode, was unbothered by what he found. He is said to have made a remark, in the immediate aftermath, about the ace of spades still lying on the table near Masseria's body, a small, dark joke about a dead man caught holding the wrong card at exactly the wrong moment, the kind of gallows humor that men who have spent their lives around sudden death often develop as a kind of psychological armor against the weight of what they have just witnessed, or in Luciano's case, what he had just orchestrated. Police arrived at Nuova Villa tomorrow not long after the shooting to find a scene that had, by Underworld standards, already been rendered almost forensically useless. There were no cooperative witnesses. There was no one willing to identify the gunman, even among restaurant staff who had presumably seen at least something of what had happened. This was, again, entirely consistent with the pattern of underworld killings throughout this era, a pattern rooted not simply in fear, though fear was certainly present, but in a broader, deeply entrenched code among Italian immigrant communities and the criminal organizations embedded within them that outside authorities, and the official American legal system they represented, had no legitimate claim on the internal business of the underworld. Masseria's murder, like so many gangland killings of the Prohibition era, would never result in a criminal prosecution. No one was ever formally charged. The case remained, in the official language of the New York Police Department, unsolved, even though within the underworld itself, and eventually within the broader public understanding of this period of American criminal history, the basic outline of what had happened, and who had orchestrated it, became an open secret. The death of Giuseppe Masseria on April 20, 1931, marked, in the most immediate and practical sense, the effective end of the Castellammarese War. With Masseria gone, the primary obstacle to a negotiated peace between the two warring factions had been removed, and within a remarkably short period of time, a matter of weeks, by most accounts, a formal peace was arranged between Luciano, representing the remnants of Masseria's former organization, and Salvatore Maranzano, whose Castellammarese faction now stood, at least on paper, as the victorious side in a war that had cost dozens of lives across the better part of 2 years. Maranzano moved quickly to consolidate his victory into something approaching formal, citywide authority. In the weeks following Masseria's death, he convened what has since become one of the most storied gatherings in the entire history of American organized crime, a mass meeting, reportedly held in a large rented hall in the Bronx, attended by hundreds of Italian-American gangsters from across New York and, according to some accounts, from other cities as well, where Maranzano formally declared himself the boss of bosses, The capo di tutti capi, in the Sicilian phrasing that had traveled across the Atlantic along with the criminal traditions of the old country, and laid out an ambitious plan to reorganize New York's Italian underworld into a formal, hierarchical structure of 5 families, each governed by its own boss, underboss, and network of lieutenants and soldiers, with Maranzano himself sitting atop the entire structure as its supreme and unquestioned authority. It is worth pausing here to note the strange, almost cyclical irony embedded in this moment. Maranzano's vision for New York's reorganized underworld was, in its basic structural outline, 5 families, each with defined territory and defined leadership, a genuine innovation, one that would go on, in modified form, to define the structure of the American Mafia for decades to come, long after Maranzano himself had left the scene. But the manner in which Maranzano sought to impose that structure, and above all the singular, supreme authority he claimed for himself at the top of it, replicated almost exactly the kind of rigid, autocratic, old-world dominance that had made Masseria himself so intolerable to the younger generation of gangsters who had engineered his death in the first place. Maranzano, the beneficiary of a conspiracy built on younger men's frustration with old-world tyranny, appeared, within weeks of claiming his victory, to be constructing a version of that same tyranny under his own name. Luciano, along with the other younger, more forward-thinking gangsters who had helped bring the war to its conclusion, understood this dynamic almost immediately, and understood, with the same cold, calculating clarity that had guided their decision to move against Masseria, that Maranzano's ambitions represented not the end of the old world problem but simply its continuation under new management. Maranzano, for his part, appears to have harbored genuine suspicions about Luciano's own ambitions and loyalty, suspicions that were, in fact, entirely justified, though Maranzano would not live long enough to see exactly how justified they were. Within months of declaring himself boss of bosses, Maranzano had reportedly begun making his own plans to eliminate Luciano and several of his closest allies, having concluded, correctly, that the same qualities of ambition and ruthless pragmatism that had made Luciano so useful in bringing down Masseria made him equally dangerous to leave alive and unchecked. Luciano, learning of Maranzano's plans through his own network of informants within the underworld, a network that, by 1931, had become considerably more sophisticated and far-reaching than anything Maranzano himself appears to have anticipated, moved first. On September 10, 1931, less than 5 months after Masseria's murder at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a group of men, reportedly posing as government agents conducting a tax investigation, gained entry to Maranzano's office in Midtown Manhattan and killed him in a brief, brutal confrontation that brought an end, in almost startlingly rapid succession, to the second of the 2 old-world bosses whose rivalry had defined the Castellammarese War. With both Masseria and Maranzano now dead within the span of less than half a year, the path was clear for Luciano and his allies to reshape New York's Italian underworld according to their own vision, a vision that retained much of Maranzano's structural innovation, the division of the city's Italian organized crime into 5 distinct families, but that abandoned entirely the notion of a single supreme boss of bosses ruling over the whole structure. In its place, Luciano and his associates established what became known as the Commission, a governing body composed of the bosses of the 5 New York families along with representatives from other major American cities, designed to resolve disputes, coordinate major decisions, and prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic, citywide warfare that had consumed New York's underworld for the better part of 2 years, without ever again concentrating that much singular, unchecked authority in the hands of any one man. It was, in its own dark way, a genuinely revolutionary transformation, the moment at which the American Mafia shifted decisively away from the old-world model of personal, autocratic rule that men like Masseria and Maranzano had embodied, and towards something closer to a modern corporate structure, with distributed authority, negotiated agreements, and a governing council designed to manage conflict through something other than open warfare. Luciano, who would go on to become the most powerful and influential figure in this new structure, had accomplished, through the calculated betrayal and killing of 2 men who had each, in his own way, trusted or at least underestimated him, exactly the transformation of New York's criminal underworld that he and his younger, more forward-thinking allies had envisioned since the earliest days of the Castellammarese War. But this story, the story of Joe Masseria, the boy from Menfi who survived a bullet in Sicily, who built himself into the most feared boss in New York through nothing but appetite and violence, who dodged death so many times that grown men whispered he had made some dark bargain with fate itself. This story does not end with the reorganization of the American Mafia into the commission structure that would define it for the rest of the 20th century. Because to truly understand what Masseria's death meant, we need to look more closely at the man himself, the empire he built, the fear he inspired, the loyalty he commanded and ultimately lost, and the particular tragedy of a man whose entire identity had been built around the belief that he could not be killed, undone in the end not by a rival's bullet but by the quiet, patient betrayal of the very lieutenant he had trusted like a son. To understand the true scale of what died with Joe Masseria on that Coney Island afternoon, you have to step back from the gunfire for a moment and look at the machine he had actually built, because the empire behind the myth was, in its own grim way, just as remarkable as the legend of the man who could not be killed. By the late 1920s, at the height of his power, Masseria did not simply command a gang in the way that phrase is sometimes casually used to describe the smaller, looser criminal crews that populated New York's underworld. He commanded something closer to a diversified criminal enterprise, an organization that touched nearly every corner of the city's illegal economy and, through corruption and bribery, a fair portion of its legal economy as well. Bootlegging formed the backbone of his wealth, as it did for virtually every major criminal figure of the Prohibition era, but Masseria's organization extended its reach far beyond the simple importation and distribution of illegal liquor. He controlled a network of gambling operations scattered across Manhattan and into the boroughs, card games, dice games, numbers rackets that extracted a steady, dependable stream of income from immigrant communities who had few other outlets for the particular mixture of hope and desperation that fueled illegal gambling in that era. He controlled loan sharking operations that preyed on small merchants and laborers caught in the gap between their meager wages and the demands of survival in one of the most expensive cities in the world. And he controlled, as he had since his earliest days on the Lower East Side, a sprawling network of extortion rackets that taxed legitimate businesses, restaurants, bakeries, construction firms, garment manufacturers, under the constant, implicit threat of violence that had defined his reputation from the very beginning of his criminal career. What made this empire function, what allowed it to generate the kind of sustained wealth and power that Masseria commanded through the late 1920s, was not simply violence, though violence remained the ultimate enforcement mechanism underlying everything else. It was corruption, a deep, systemic web of relationships between Masseria's organization and the police officers, judges, and elected officials whose cooperation, whether purchased through direct bribery or secured through the simple political reality of an era in which organized crime and machine politics were often deeply, inextricably intertwined, allowed his operations to function with a degree of impunity that would be almost unimaginable in a later, more reform-minded era of American law. Enforcement. New York City in the 1920s was governed, in practice if not always in official title, by Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that had dominated the city's politics for the better part of a century and that maintained its own extensive, symbiotic relationships with the criminal underworld, relationships built on votes delivered, favors exchanged, and the shared understanding that certain categories of illegal activity, particularly gambling and the illegal liquor trade that Prohibition had made so extraordinarily lucrative, would be tolerated by the authorities in exchange for a share of the profits and a reliable flow of political support in immigrant neighborhoods where machine politicians depended heavily on the loyalty of criminal organizations to turn out votes and suppress opposition. Masseria, like virtually every major criminal boss of this era, understood the value of these relationships and cultivated them carefully, ensuring that a portion of his enormous bootlegging and gambling profits flowed steadily toward the police captains, ward heelers, and local judges whose cooperation, or at minimum whose willful blindness, made his continued operation possible. This system of corruption was not unique to Masseria, it was, in fact, the underlying condition that made Prohibition-era organized crime possible on the scale it achieved across virtually every major American city during this period. But Masseria's organization, by virtue of its sheer size and reach, maintained a correspondingly extensive network of these compromised relationships, giving him a degree of protection from serious legal consequences that helps explain how a man with as violent and public a reputation as his was able to operate for so many years with only sporadic arrests, none of which ever produced a conviction serious enough to remove him from the streets for any meaningful length of time. The soldiers who served under Masseria, the foot soldiers of his organization, the men who carried out the day-to-day work of running gambling operations, collecting extortion payments, and, when necessary, enforcing discipline through violence, operated within a structure that, while less formally codified than the commission system that Luciano would later establish, nonetheless reflected many of the same underlying principles of loyalty, hierarchy, and mutual obligation that had governed Sicilian criminal organizations for generations. A soldier who served Masseria loyally could expect protection, a share of the organization's profits, and a degree of status within the immigrant community that was otherwise largely unavailable to men whose formal education and legitimate economic opportunities remained severely limited by the discrimination and poverty that defined immigrant life in this era. In exchange, that soldier owed Masseria absolute obedience, discretion about the organization's activities, and a willingness to use violence on Masseria's behalf whenever the boss's interests required it. It was a system built, in other words, on exactly the same combination of paternalistic protection and ruthless demand that had characterized the criminal organizations of rural Sicily from which Masseria himself had emerged decades earlier, a system transplanted, largely intact, into the very different social and economic environment of Prohibition-era New York, and one that proved, for a remarkably long stretch of the 1920s, extraordinarily effective at generating wealth and maintaining order within Masseria's own ranks, whatever chaos and violence it produced in his organization's ongoing conflicts with external rivals. But there was a particular quality to Masseria's leadership, a quality that multiple accounts from men who served under him or observed him closely during this period consistently describe, that helps explain both the loyalty he commanded from his soldiers and the resentment that was quietly accumulating among his more ambitious, forward-thinking lieutenants throughout the late 1920s. Masseria ruled through fear far more than through inspiration or genuine strategic vision. He was, by most accounts, a man of considerable physical appetite and limited patience, famous, even within an underworld not known for restraint, for his enormous meals, his blunt and often crude manner of speech, and a temper that could shift with little warning from genial hospitality to violent, explosive rage. He trusted few men completely, relied heavily on brute intimidation to resolve disputes that a more patient boss might have negotiated, and displayed, according to the accounts of men like Luciano who eventually turned against him, a fundamental inflexibility that made him ill-suited to navigate the increasingly complex, increasingly lucrative criminal economy that Prohibition had created. This inflexibility manifested itself most clearly in Masseria's handling of the very rivalries and tensions that would eventually consume him. Where a more strategically minded boss might have sought accommodation with the Castellammarese faction, recognizing that a negotiated peace, however unsatisfying to his pride, would preserve more lives and more profit than an extended war, Masseria's instinct, consistent with the pattern that had defined his entire rise to power, was to demand total submission and to pursue that submission through escalating violence regardless of the mounting costs. It was an approach that had served him well throughout the 1920s, when his organization's size and resources gave him a decisive advantage over most rivals he encountered. But it proved catastrophically unsuited to a conflict against an opponent like Maranzano, whose own stubbornness and whose access to allied Castellammarese networks across multiple American cities meant that the war Masseria had launched in pursuit of absolute dominance instead dragged on for the better part of 2 years, bleeding both organizations dry and creating exactly the conditions of exhaustion and frustration that made Luciano's eventual betrayal not just possible but, in retrospect, almost inevitable. There is a particular kind of tragedy embedded in this pattern, one that recurs throughout the history of organized crime with a regularity that borders on the mythic, the very qualities that allow a man to claw his way to the top of a violent, competitive criminal hierarchy: ruthlessness, an unwillingness to compromise, an absolute insistence on personal dominance, are often precisely the qualities that make it impossible for that same man to hold on to power once he has achieved it, because those qualities alienate exactly the ambitious, capable subordinates whose continued loyalty is essential to any organization's long-term survival. Masseria built his empire through appetite and violence, and it was appetite and violence, wielded now by men he had trained and promoted, that ultimately destroyed him. It is worth considering, too, what Masseria's death meant not simply for the structure of organized crime in New York, but for the broader arc of American criminal history that followed in its wake. The commission system that Luciano established in the aftermath of Masseria's and Maranzano's deaths would go on to govern the American Mafia's internal affairs for decades, providing a framework for managing disputes between families, coordinating major criminal enterprises across city and even national boundaries, and, crucially, preventing the kind of catastrophic, citywide gang warfare that had defined the Castellammarese War from ever again consuming New York's underworld on quite that same destructive scale. In this sense, Masseria's death did not simply end one man's life or one particular criminal organization's dominance, it marked the definitive transition point between an older, more chaotic, more personally autocratic model of Italian-American organized crime and the more stable, more corporate, more durable structure that would allow the Mafia to survive and even flourish for generations after Prohibition itself had ended. There is also a darker, more personal dimension to this story that deserves attention, one that goes beyond the structural and historical significance of Masseria's death to consider what it meant on the more intimate, human scale of betrayal and loss. The relationship between Masseria and Luciano, whatever its ultimate outcome, appears to have been, for a significant stretch of years, something closer to genuine mentorship than pure transactional convenience. Masseria had elevated Luciano beyond what his raw criminal talents alone might have earned him in a more purely meritocratic organization. He had extended to the younger man a degree of trust, access, and apparent affection that multiple accounts describe in terms suggesting something closer to paternal pride than simple business calculation. That Luciano was ultimately willing to orchestrate his mentor's death, to sit across a card table from a man who trusted him completely, to excuse himself with a mundane lie about needing the restroom, and to return only after the gunmen he had arranged had finished their work, speaks to a particular, chilling clarity of purpose that separates the truly formidable figures of organized crime history from the merely violent ones. Luciano did not kill Masseria out of hatred, or even primarily out of personal ambition in any narrow sense. He killed him because Masseria had become, in Luciano's calculation, an obstacle to a larger, more rational, more profitable reorganization of an entire criminal economy, and Luciano possessed, in a way that Masseria himself never quite did, the particular kind of coldness required to prioritize that larger calculation over personal loyalty, however genuine that loyalty might once have been. This coldness, this capacity to separate personal affection from strategic necessity, would go on to define Luciano's entire subsequent career as the most powerful figure in the reorganized American Mafia, a career that included his own eventual downfall through a 1936 prostitution racketeering conviction, his years of imprisonment, his wartime cooperation with U.S. naval intelligence that reportedly helped secure Sicilian support for the Allied invasion of Italy, and his eventual deportation to Italy in 1946, where he would live out the remainder of his life in a kind of exile, still commanding respect and influence within the criminal underworld even as he was permanently barred from returning to the country and the city where he had built his power. But all of that lay in the future in the spring of 1931. In the immediate aftermath of Masseria's death, what mattered most, both to the men who had orchestrated it and to the broader underworld that watched the transition unfold, was the simple, undeniable fact that Joe the Boss, the man who could not be killed, the man whose survival through repeated assassination attempts had built a legend bordering on the supernatural, was dead. The myth had finally met its limit. The bullets that missed him on 2nd Avenue in 1922, and in the various other attempts on his life throughout the 1920s, had simply been bullets fired by men who lacked the patience, the access, and the willingness to betray a trusted relationship that Luciano possessed. In the end, it was not superior firepower or superior numbers that finally killed Joe Masseria. It was intimacy. It was trust, weaponized. It was the particular, devastating vulnerability that comes from believing yourself surrounded by loyal men, when in fact you are surrounded by men patiently waiting for the right moment to become something else entirely. Masseria's funeral, held in the days following his death, was reportedly a modest affair by the standards of the era's more elaborate gangland funerals, a reflection, perhaps, of the underworld's collective understanding that Masseria's death represented not simply the loss of a respected boss but the conclusion of an increasingly unpopular and increasingly costly war, one that most of the surviving participants on both sides were relieved, on some level, to see finally brought to an end. There was no great outpouring of public grief, no elaborate procession through the streets of Little Italy of the kind that had sometimes marked the deaths of earlier, more universally respected underworld figures. Masseria died as he had lived in many respects, powerful, feared, but never quite beloved, a man whose empire had been built on appetite and intimidation rather than on the kind of broader loyalty and affection that might have produced a more elaborate public mourning. And yet, in the decades that followed, as the full scope of what his death had set in motion became increasingly clear to historians and chroniclers of American organized crime, Joe Masseria's place in the story of the Mafia's development in the United States would prove far more significant than the modest scale of his funeral might have suggested. He was, in the final accounting, the last great old world boss to hold something approaching singular, absolute power over New York's Italian underworld, the final embodiment of a model of criminal leadership rooted in Sicilian tradition, personal dominance, and violent, uncompromising ambition. His death, and the reorganization that followed it, marked the definitive end of that era and the beginning of something new, a more distributed, more businesslike, more distinctly American model of organized crime that would go on to shape the popular imagination, and the actual criminal landscape of the United States, for the rest of the 20th century. In the weeks and months that followed Masseria's death, New York's underworld did something that must have seemed, to the ordinary immigrants and shopkeepers and laborers who lived alongside it without ever fully understanding its inner workings, almost impossible. It settled down. The gunfire that had echoed through Brooklyn and the Bronx and the Lower East Side for the better part of 2 years grew quieter, then stopped almost entirely. Men who had spent 1930 and the early months of 1931 watching over their shoulders, sleeping in different apartments each week, avoiding their usual restaurants and barbershops and social clubs for fear of exactly the kind of ambush that had ended Masseria's life, began, cautiously, to return to the rhythms of ordinary criminal business. It was as if the entire underworld had been holding its breath for a year and a half, and now, finally, it could exhale. But the peace that settled over New York's Italian underworld in the wake of Masseria's death was not simply the natural exhaustion of two warring factions finally running out of soldiers willing to die for a cause that had stopped making sense to anyone except the two old men at the top. It was an engineered peace, deliberately constructed by Luciano and his allies with a level of foresight and strategic patience that stood in stark, almost unsettling contrast to the reactive, appetite-driven violence that had characterized both Masseria's rise and his fall. The 5 months between Masseria's death in April and Maranzano's own killing in September of 1931 deserve closer attention than they sometimes receive in popular retellings of this story, because it was during this brief, uneasy interregnum that the true shape of what Luciano intended became visible to anyone paying close attention. Maranzano, having declared himself boss of bosses at his mass gathering in the Bronx, began almost immediately imposing attacks on the various family bosses and crews now nominally under his authority, a formalized system of tribute that echoed, in its structure if not its precise mechanics, the kind of demand for submission that Masseria himself had made of the Castellammarese faction before the war began. It was, in other words, precisely the sort of old-world autocracy that had made the war necessary in the first place, now simply relocated to a different throne. Luciano watched this unfold with the same cold, patient calculation that had guided his decision to move against Masseria 5 months earlier. He had not orchestrated the death of one autocrat simply to install another in his place, and the growing tension between Luciano's circle and Maranzano's inner court became, through the summer of 1931, an open secret within the upper ranks of New York's reorganized underworld. Maranzano, for his part, was neither naive nor careless. He understood, correctly, that Luciano represented a threat to his authority, and by late summer he had reportedly begun assembling his own plans to eliminate Luciano along with several of his closest allies, Vito Genovese chief among them, hoping to remove the one faction within his newly reorganized structure capable of challenging his supreme position. What happened instead has become one of the most frequently recounted episodes in the popular history of American organized crime, told and retold in books, documentaries, and films until its details have taken on a kind of folkloric polish that sometimes obscures just how audacious the operation actually was. On September 10, 1931, a group of men arrived at Maranzano's office on Park Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, presenting themselves, according to the most widely repeated version of events, as agents of the Internal Revenue Service or the New York Police Department conducting a tax investigation. A ruse clever enough to get them past Maranzano's own security without triggering the kind of violent confrontation that a more obviously armed approach might have provoked. Once inside, the men attacked Maranzano directly, and in the brief, brutal struggle that followed, he was stabbed and shot to death in his own office, less than 5 months after he had declared himself the supreme ruler of New York's reorganized Italian underworld. The killing of Maranzano was, in its planning and execution, a kind of grim echo of what had happened to Masseria, another boss struck down not through the kind of dramatic street ambush that had defined so much of the Castellammarese War's violence, but through a carefully engineered breach of trust and security, carried out by men who understood that the most effective way to eliminate a powerful, well-guarded target was not through overwhelming force but through deception and precision. Whether the same men who had killed Masseria in April also participated in Maranzano's killing in September remains, like so much of this history, a matter of some dispute among historians, though the broader pattern of Luciano orchestrating both killings through carefully selected, reliable operatives is not seriously contested. With Maranzano's death, the two men whose personal rivalry had defined and driven the Castellammarese War were both gone, both dead within less than half a year of each other, and the path was now genuinely clear for Luciano to implement the vision that he and his allies, Meyer Lansky prominent among them, along with figures like Frank Costello and, for a time, Vito Genovese, had been developing throughout the course of the war itself. What Luciano built in the aftermath was, by the standards of the criminal world that had produced him, something genuinely novel, a formal governing structure, later known as the Commission, that brought together the leadership of what had by this point solidified into New York's 5 major Italian-American crime families, along with representatives from powerful organizations in other major American cities, most notably Chicago. The Commission was designed not as a hierarchy with a single supreme boss sitting above all others, the very model that had defined and ultimately doomed both Masseria and Maranzano, but as something closer to a governing council, a body through which disputes between families could be adjudicated, major decisions affecting the broader criminal economy could be coordinated, and, crucially, future conflicts of the kind that had just consumed New York's underworld for nearly 2 years could theoretically be prevented before they escalated into open warfare. This was not simply an act of institutional creativity for its own sake. It reflected a genuinely different philosophy of how criminal power should be organized and exercised, one that Luciano and his closest allies had been developing, both consciously and instinctively, throughout their years of service under bosses like Masseria, whose autocratic, appetite-driven style of leadership had, in Luciano's clear-eyed assessment, produced enormous instability, enormous unnecessary violence, and enormous risk to the underlying business interests that all of these organizations, whatever their internal rivalries, fundamentally depended upon. Luciano's genius, and here the word applies with considerably more justification than it ever did to Masseria, lay in his recognition that the criminal economy Prohibition had created was, at its core, a business, and that businesses, however illegal their underlying activities, function best under conditions of relative stability, predictable rules, and mechanisms for resolving disputes that do not automatically default to violence. The old world model that Masseria and Maranzano had each, in their own way, embodied, a model built around personal loyalty to a single dominant boss, honor codes rooted in Sicilian village tradition, and a willingness to escalate to open warfare rather than accept any perceived diminishment of personal authority, had produced, across the span of the Castellammarese War, enormous costs, dozens of dead soldiers, disrupted operations, unwanted attention from law enforcement and the press, and a level of internal instability that threatened the long-term viability of the entire criminal enterprise these organizations had built during the extraordinarily lucrative years of Prohibition. The commission system that emerged from the ashes of that war represented Luciano's answer to those costs, a recognition that the American Mafia, if it wanted to survive and prosper over the long term, needed to evolve away from the personalized, feudal structures its founders had carried across the Atlantic and towards something closer to the more distributed, more procedurally governed structures of American corporate capitalism itself. It is one of the genuinely striking ironies of this history that the men who built the modern American Mafia in the years following Masseria's death did so by consciously modeling their new structure, at least in its broad outlines, on exactly the kind of rationalized, board-governed business organization that men like Masseria, rooted so firmly in the personal, honor-bound traditions of rural Sicily, would likely have found almost incomprehensible. Beyond the structural transformation of the commission itself, the end of the Castellammarese War also marked a significant shift in the ethnic and cultural composition of organized crime's upper leadership in New York and, eventually, across the country. Luciano's own close working relationships with figures like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, relationships that dated back to his childhood on the streets of the Lower East Side, long before the Castellammarese War had even begun, reflected a genuinely different approach to criminal alliance building than the strictly Sicilian, often village-specific loyalties that had defined organizations like Masseria's and Maranzano's. Where the old-world bosses had generally confined their most trusted inner circles to men who shared their specific regional origins within Sicily or southern Italy, Luciano and the broader cohort of younger, American-raised gangsters who rose to prominence in the aftermath of the war proved far more willing to build lasting criminal partnerships across ethnic lines, Italian and Jewish gangsters in particular, who had grown up together on the same crowded Lower East Side streets, developed working relationships and shared business interests that would go on to define significant portions of organized crime's operations for decades to come, from the casino industry that Lansky helped pioneer in Las Vegas to the labor racketeering operations that spanned numerous American industries throughout the mid-20th century. This transition, from a fractured landscape of ethnically and regionally specific gangs bound by old-world honor codes, to a more integrated, more business-like criminal economy governed by negotiated agreements and cross-ethnic partnerships, represents, in the assessment of most serious historians of American organized crime, the single most consequential structural transformation to emerge from the entire Castellammarese War. It is, in a very real sense, the moment at which the American Mafia stopped being simply an extension of Sicilian criminal tradition transplanted onto American soil, and became instead something distinctly new, an American criminal institution, shaped by American urban geography, American ethnic politics, and the particular economic opportunities and legal vulnerabilities that Prohibition and the broader American regulatory environment of the early 20th century had created. None of this, it is worth emphasizing, unfolded smoothly or without further violence in the years immediately following 1931. The reorganized underworld that Luciano built remained, as any criminal enterprise built on illegal markets inevitably remains, subject to ongoing internal disputes, occasional outbreaks of violence between rival factions, and the constant, grinding pressure of law enforcement attention that intensified considerably as the 1930s progressed and public tolerance for the visible excesses of Prohibition-era organized crime began to wane. Luciano himself, despite having engineered one of the most consequential reorganizations in the history of American crime, would see his own reign at the top of this new structure cut dramatically short. In 1936, he was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution, charges brought by an ambitious young prosecutor named Thomas Dewey, who had built his own career in significant part on the high-profile pursuit of organized crime figures, and sentenced to a lengthy prison term that removed him from direct control of his criminal empire for years, even as he continued, from behind bars, to exercise significant influence over the organization he had built. The particular circumstances of Luciano's eventual downfall carry their own dark symmetry with the story of the man he had betrayed and killed 5 years earlier. Masseria had believed himself untouchable because he had survived so many attempts on his life through violence. Luciano, in his own way, may have believed himself similarly insulated by the sophistication of the structure he had built, the careful legal and financial arrangements designed to keep the most incriminating aspects of his operations at arm's length from his own direct involvement. But the American legal system, however slow and however compromised by corruption in this era, eventually proved capable of reaching even a man as careful and as well insulated as Luciano had tried to be, a reminder, if this story needed one, that no criminal empire, however cleverly structured, however cold-bloodedly and rationally managed, is ever truly beyond the reach of consequence. Luciano's later years followed a trajectory almost as remarkable, in its own way, as his rise to power in the aftermath of the Castellammarese War. During the Second World War, American naval intelligence, concerned about the security of New York's waterfront against potential sabotage and seeking assistance in preparing for the eventual Allied invasion of Sicily, reportedly reached out to Luciano, still imprisoned, for his assistance in securing cooperation from Italian-American dockworkers and, eventually, from Sicilian criminal networks with knowledge of the island's terrain and local political dynamics. This cooperation, whatever its precise scope and effectiveness, a subject that remains genuinely disputed among historians, with some crediting it as significant assistance to the war effort and others dismissing it as considerably exaggerated in the years since, reportedly contributed to Luciano's eventual release from prison in 1946, on the condition that he be immediately deported to Italy, permanently barred from ever again setting foot in the United States, the country and the city where he had built and ultimately lost his empire. He spent the remainder of his life largely in Italy, dying in Naples in 1962, still, by most accounts, a figure of considerable respect and influence within the international criminal networks he had helped shape, even as the American underworld he had once dominated had, by that point, moved on considerably from the structures and figures of the Castellammarese War era. It is a fitting, if somewhat melancholy, coda to the story of a man whose entire rise to power had been built on cold calculation and the careful management of loyalty and betrayal, that his final years were spent in a kind of permanent, if comfortable, exile, forever separated from the city and the empire that had defined the whole of his violent, extraordinary life. But it is Masseria's story, not Luciano's, that this series has set out to tell, and it is worth returning, in these final chapters, to the question of how history has ultimately judged the man they call Joe the Boss, and what his particular, violent trajectory through the underworld of Prohibition-era New York can tell us about the broader forces that shaped American organized crime during this pivotal, transformative period. Masseria has often been remembered, in the decades since his death, in somewhat reductive terms, as the archetypal Mustache Pete, the stubborn old-world boss whose rigid, violent, autocratic style of leadership made him an obstacle to the more sophisticated, more business-like criminal order that men like Luciano would go on to build. There is real truth in this characterization, but it also risks flattening a more complicated, more genuinely tragic figure into a simple foil for the more celebrated criminal innovators who came after him. Masseria was, whatever his tactical and strategic limitations, a man who had built, through nothing but raw ambition, physical courage, and a willingness to use violence that few of his contemporaries could match, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the history of American organized crime up to that point. He had survived poverty, discrimination, and repeated attempts on his own life to become, for a significant stretch of the 1920s, the single most feared and powerful figure in New York's Italian underworld, an achievement that, whatever its ultimately violent and exploitative foundations, represented a genuine, if dark, triumph over the circumstances of his birth into rural poverty in western Sicily. His downfall, when it came, was not simply the product of his own personal failings, though those failings were real and significant. It was also the product of forces larger than himself, the changing demographics and changing cultural attitudes of a new, American-raised generation of gangsters who had grown up under circumstances different enough from his own that the old-world loyalties and honor codes he had built his entire life around no longer commanded the same automatic deference they once had. In this sense, Masseria's story is not simply the story of one violent man's rise and fall. It is the story of an entire generation of immigrant criminal leaders, men who had built their power in the crucible of Sicilian poverty and American discrimination, watching that power slip away as their own children and protégés, raised in a different world with different values and different strategic instincts, concluded that the old ways, however profitable, however feared, however deeply rooted in the traditions their fathers had carried across the Atlantic, had finally, decisively, outlived their usefulness. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a story like this one once the guns have finally gone quiet, once the last of the men who lived it have gone to their own graves, and once the history has passed from lived memory into something closer to legend, retold and reshaped by each new generation of writers, filmmakers, and storytellers who take up the thread. Joe Masseria's story reached that kind of silence a long time ago. He died in 1931. Luciano followed him into history's judgment decades later, dying in exile in Naples in 1962. The soldiers who pulled the trigger at Nuova Villa Tammaro, Genovese, Anastasia, Adonis, Siegel, each went on to live out extraordinary, violent lives of their own, building and losing their own empires, meeting their own ends in ways that ranged from Genovese's death in a federal prison hospital to Anastasia's own assassination, gunned down in a barber's chair in 1957 in an echo of the very kind of ambush that had once nearly claimed Masseria's life a generation earlier, to Siegel's murder. In Beverly Hills in 1947, shot through a window while sitting in his girlfriend's living room, in a killing whose full motive remains debated by historians to this day. The underworld that Masseria helped build, and that his death helped transform, kept moving forward without him, the way underworlds always do, indifferent in the end to the particular men who happened to occupy its thrones at any given moment. But if we step back from the particular fates of the individual men involved in this story, and look instead at the broader arc of what the Castellammarese War actually accomplished, what it destroyed, what it built, and what it set in motion for decades to come, a picture emerges that is considerably more significant, and considerably more instructive, than the story of a single violent gangster's rise and fall. The most immediate and measurable legacy of the war, and of Masseria's death in particular, was structural, the creation of the commission system that would go on to govern the American Mafia's internal affairs for the better part of the 20th century. This was not a minor administrative footnote to the larger drama of betrayal and assassination that defined the war's conclusion. It was, in the assessment of virtually every serious historian who has studied the development of American organized crime, the single most important institutional innovation in the entire history of the Mafia's presence in the United States, a structural transformation that allowed Italian-American organized crime to survive, adapt, and in many respects flourish for decades after the specific economic conditions that had produced its initial explosive growth, namely Prohibition itself, had long since disappeared. Consider what the Commission actually accomplished in the years following its establishment. It provided a mechanism, however imperfect and however frequently strained by individual ambition and betrayal, for resolving disputes between the major New York families and their counterparts in other cities without automatically defaulting to the kind of catastrophic, citywide warfare that had consumed New York for nearly 2 years under Masseria and Maranzano. It established, for the first time in the history of Italian-American organized crime, something approaching a formal system of governance, rules, however unwritten and however frequently bent or broken, about how territorial disputes would be handled, how new bosses would be recognized, and how the enormous profits generated by the underworld's various enterprises would be protected from the kind of destructive internal conflict that had nearly destroyed both Masseria's and Maranzano's organizations in the process of their mutual destruction. This is not to suggest that the Commission ushered in some kind of enduring golden age of underworld peace. Organized crime in America remained, in the decades following 1931, a world defined by violence, betrayal, and periodic eruptions of exactly the kind of internal warfare the Commission had theoretically been designed to prevent. The 1950s and 1960s would see their own significant conflicts within and between the major families, including further high-profile assassinations and power struggles that echoed, in smaller and more contained ways, the dynamics that had driven the Castellammarese War itself. But the basic structural framework that Luciano had established in the aftermath of Masseria's death, the division of New York's underworld into 5 distinct families, the existence of a commission capable of mediating disputes between them, and the general abandonment of the old world model of a single supreme boss ruling over the entire structure, proved remarkably durable, remaining, in its essential outlines, the governing structure of the American Mafia for the better part of the following 60 years. Beyond its structural legacy, the Castellammarese War and Masseria's death also marked a decisive cultural and generational transition within American organized crime, a transition that historians have sometimes summarized, with a certain amount of oversimplification, as the passing of the Mustache Pete's and the rise of what came to be called, somewhat imprecisely, the Americanized Mafia. This framing captures something real and important about the transformation that occurred in the years following 1931, even if it risks flattening a more complicated set of changes into an overly tidy generational narrative. What actually changed, in the wake of Masseria's death, was not simply that younger, more American-raised gangsters replaced older, more Sicilian-rooted ones at the top of New York's criminal hierarchy, though that generational shift was certainly real and significant. What changed, more fundamentally, was the underlying logic that governed how criminal power was built, exercised, and maintained. Masseria's entire career had been built on a model of leadership rooted in personal dominance, violent intimidation, and the specific honor codes and loyalty structures of rural Sicilian village culture, transplanted with relatively little modification onto the streets of New York. Luciano's reorganization, by contrast, reflected a model of leadership rooted far more heavily in negotiated agreement, distributed authority, and a pragmatic, almost corporate approach to managing the enormous financial enterprises that Prohibition-era organized crime had created. An approach that drew as much from the practical lessons of American business organization as it did from any specifically Italian or Sicilian criminal tradition. This shift had consequences that extended well beyond the specific fortunes of New York's Italian underworld. The model of organized crime that emerged from the ashes of the Castellammarese War, hierarchical but distributed, violent but increasingly disciplined about when and how that violence was deployed, rooted in ethnic loyalty but increasingly willing to build strategic partnerships across ethnic lines when profit demanded it, became, in the decades that followed, something close to the template for American organized crime more broadly, influencing not just the Italian-American families that had emerged directly from the Castellammarese War but the broader landscape of American criminal enterprise that developed alongside and sometimes in partnership with them, from the Jewish gangsters like Lansky who helped pioneer the American casino industry to the various ethnic criminal organizations that would rise to prominence in American cities in the decades that followed. It is worth pausing, in these final reflections, to consider what Masseria's story ultimately reveals about the particular psychology of men who build empires through fear and violence, and about the particular vulnerability that such empires almost inevitably carry within themselves, however powerful and however seemingly unassailable they may appear at their height. Masseria's entire public identity, the myth that had grown up around him since his teenage years in Sicily and that had only deepened through the repeated assassination attempts he survived in New York during the 1920s, was built on the idea of invincibility, the notion that he was, in some fundamental way, untouchable, protected by fate or fortune or some darker and more ancient force that ordinary bullets could not overcome. This myth served him well for a remarkably long time, functioning exactly as such myths are designed to function, deterring rivals who might otherwise have been tempted to challenge him, inspiring a kind of superstitious loyalty among soldiers who had come to view their boss as something more than an ordinary man, and providing Masseria himself with a sense of confidence and authority that surely contributed, in no small measure, to his extraordinary rise from penniless immigrant to the most powerful criminal boss in New York. But the myth of invincibility, as we noted earlier in this story, carries within it a particular and ultimately fatal trap. A man who comes to believe too completely in his own untouchability inevitably grows careless about the ordinary precautions that keep less mythologized men alive. He extends trust more freely than caution would otherwise dictate, because a part of him has come to genuinely believe that fate itself has marked him for survival regardless of the risks he takes or the men he chooses to trust. This is, in the final analysis, precisely what happened to Masseria in the months and years leading up to his death. He had survived so many attempts on his life from external enemies, rival bosses, competing factions, men who wanted his territory or resented his growing dominance, that he appears to have lost the capacity to seriously consider the possibility that the greatest threat to his life might come not from outside his organization but from within it, from a lieutenant he had personally elevated, trusted, and treated with something approaching genuine paternal affection. This particular blindness, this inability to imagine betrayal from someone he had chosen to trust completely, is not unique to Masseria. It is, in fact, one of the most consistent and recurring patterns across the entire history of organized crime, repeating itself with almost mechanical regularity across different eras, different cities, and different criminal organizations, right up to the present day. The bosses who survive the longest, who build the most durable and lasting criminal empires, tend to be precisely the ones who never fully succumb to this particular blindness, who maintain, even at the height of their power, a persistent and disciplined suspicion of everyone around them, including and perhaps especially the men closest to them, the lieutenants and protégés whose loyalty seems, on the surface, most secure and most beyond question. Masseria, for all his physical courage and all his ruthless effectiveness in building his empire, never fully developed this particular, paranoid discipline. He trusted Luciano completely, right up until the final moments of his life, and that trust, more than any tactical or strategic failure, is ultimately what killed him. There is something almost unbearably human in this final detail, something that elevates Masseria's story beyond a simple cautionary tale about the dangers of the criminal life and into something closer to genuine tragedy in the classical sense. Masseria was not undone by a rival's superior firepower, or by some clever strategic maneuver he failed to anticipate from an external enemy. He was undone by his own capacity for trust and affection, by the very human, very understandable desire to have someone in his life he could rely on completely, someone he could treat as something closer to a son than a mere subordinate. That this trust was ultimately exploited, calculated, and turned into the precise instrument of his death does not diminish the genuine tragedy embedded in the betrayal itself. If anything, it deepens it. Masseria's fatal flaw, in the end, was not cruelty, or greed, or violence, qualities he certainly possessed in abundance, and qualities that had defined his entire rise to power. His fatal flaw was that he loved, or at least trusted, in a world that offered absolutely no protection for that particular kind of vulnerability. In the decades since his death, Masseria's own place in the popular imagination has remained considerably smaller than that of the men who succeeded him, Luciano, Lansky, and the various other architects of the modern American Mafia who have been the subjects of countless books, films, and television series exploring their lives and legacies in exhaustive detail. Masseria himself has often been relegated, in these more popular retellings, to a supporting role in someone else's story, the old-world obstacle that the more celebrated, more forward-thinking Luciano needed to overcome on his path to building the modern Mafia, rather than a figure whose own extraordinary rise from Sicilian poverty to the height of New York's criminal underworld deserves to be understood and examined on its own terms. This relative historical obscurity is, in its own way, a kind of final irony layered onto a story already saturated with irony from beginning to end. The man who once inspired such fear and such superstitious awe that gunmen whispered he could not be killed, who ate lunch through a hail of bullets without so much as flinching, who built one of the largest and most powerful criminal organizations in the history of Prohibition-era New York through nothing but raw appetite and ruthless will, has been reduced, in much of the popular retelling of this era, to little more than a footnote in the biography of the man who killed him. It is a fate that Masseria himself, with his enormous ego and his equally enormous appetite for dominance and recognition, would surely have found intolerable, had he lived long enough to witness how history would eventually choose to remember him. And yet, perhaps there is something appropriate, even fitting, in this particular pattern of historical memory, something that speaks to a deeper truth about the nature of the criminal world Masseria inhabited and helped shape. The underworld, unlike the more visible and more thoroughly documented world of legitimate politics and business, has never been especially generous toward its fallen kings. It moves forward, indifferent to the particular men who occupied its thrones at any given moment, absorbing their innovations and their institutional legacies while discarding, often quite quickly, the specific memory of their individual triumphs and tragedies. Masseria built an empire, dominated a city, survived death so many times that his own soldiers came to believe he was protected by forces beyond ordinary human understanding, and within a matter of months after his death, the underworld he had ruled had already reorganized itself around an entirely new structure, built by the very men who had killed him, with barely a backward glance at the fallen boss whose death had made that reorganization possible. This, perhaps, is the truest and most enduring lesson embedded in the story of Joe Masseria, that power built on fear, however extensive and however seemingly unassailable at its height, ultimately proves as fragile and as temporary as the mortal body of the man who wields it. Masseria dodged bullets for the better part of a decade, built an empire that stretched across the entire island of Manhattan and into the surrounding boroughs, commanded the loyalty and the fear of hundreds of soldiers, and inspired a legend of invincibility that outlived him by generations, even as the man himself proved, in the end, exactly as mortal and exactly as vulnerable as anyone else. He died not in some dramatic, climactic battle against a worthy rival, but at a card table, in a modest Coney Island restaurant, killed by men he had trusted, on an afternoon that had seemed, right up until its final violent seconds, entirely ordinary. There is a particular kind of dark poetry in that ordinariness, in the way this story, for all its scale and all its consequence, ultimately came down to something as small and human as a plate of cards left unfinished on a restaurant table, an ace of spades face up beside a dead man's hand. Masseria's entire life had been defined by extraordinary events: a childhood bullet wound in Sicily that should have killed him, repeated assassination attempts in New York that somehow always missed their mark, the rise from penniless immigrant to the most feared boss in the city's underworld. But his death, when it finally came, was almost aggressively mundane: no dramatic gunfight, no last stand, no final defiant gesture against the men who had come to kill him. Just a friend excusing himself to the restroom, and 4 men walking through a door with guns already drawn, and a game of cards that would never be finished. That, in the end, is the story of Joe Masseria, the boy who wouldn't die in Sicily, who became the man who couldn't be killed in New York, who built an empire out of nothing but appetite and violence, and the particular, brutal genius of a man who understood, better than almost anyone of his generation, that fear could be turned into an instrument of absolute power, and who was, in the final accounting, undone not by any rival's superior strength, but by the simple, devastating fact that even the most feared man in New York's underworld could not protect himself against the one threat he never truly saw coming, the quiet, patient betrayal of a man he had chosen, against every hard lesson his own violent life should have taught him, to trust completely. His war reshaped the entire structure of American organized crime. His death gave birth to a system of criminal governance that would outlast every man involved in the conflict that produced it. And his name, though smaller today in the popular imagination than the names of the men who succeeded him, remains woven permanently into the foundation of one of the most consequential and enduring criminal institutions in American history, a reminder, if we needed one, that even the men who believe themselves untouchable, who survive bullet after bullet and threat after threat, are ultimately just as human, just as vulnerable, and just as mortal as everyone else standing in the shadows of that violent, unforgiving world. If this story pulled you into the shadows and kept you there until the very end, that's exactly where I want you. There are more stories like this one waiting, more men who built empires out of nothing, who ruled through fear and died through betrayal, whose names still echo through the history of the American underworld. So if you haven't already, subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. Like this video if you want to see more stories exactly like it. And if there's a gangster, a boss, a name from the shadows of history you want me to tell next, drop it in the comments below. I read every one, and some of the best stories this channel has ever told started exactly that way. Until next time, stay in the shadows with me.